passed, what would happen is bills would be passed during the General Assembly session, and then they would essentially sit around until the reconvene session. Reconvene session happens 7 weeks after the regular session, and that's where the General Assembly gets to consider all of the actions that the governor's taken on bills. By using the 7-day rule, what would happen this year is a bill would pass. It would actually be signed by both, or it would be approved by both the House and the Senate, and they would send it to the governor, and instead of it sitting around until reconvene session, he would actually have only 7 days to make a decision on the bill. So you'll see a lot of legislation that's actually already been signed and approved. You've also seen some bills that have already been vetoed, if you see any of the press releases coming from the governor's office. So there's already been a lot of action that typically is delayed a little bit. The regular session is over, but as I said, you've got the reconvene session coming up. It comes up on April 20th. Anything that has been passed by the House and Senate, governor gets a chance to take a look at. He has to decide, I think by April 10th it is, so still has a few more weeks to make decisions on whether he's going to sign, amend, or veto all the legislation that's passed. And then General Assembly comes back for that 1 day. They have their say as whether they're going to approve or disapprove of what the governor's done. Anything that's been adopted goes into effect July 1 of this year, unless the legislation says otherwise, and the legislation specifically has to say that. Just to set the context, as I said, 9-week session, there really were 3,286 bills that were introduced. 128 of those were referred to the House Education Committee. 117 of those were referred to the Senate Education and Health Committee. But when you looked at the lay of the land and all the legislation that could have any sort of impact on FCPS, we were looking at more than 350 bills that in some way, shape, or form, I mean, some of them obviously, relatively trivial, but 350 different bills that had some bearing on what you all do here. What I thought might help, since we have a relatively limited time and trying to summarize, was to take a look at your priority positions, because you have your set of priority positions, and it's really broken down into 6 different areas, and just give you a real quick overview of some of the legislation and some of the budget actions that came out of each one of those priorities, to kind of give you an idea of what was accomplished, what wasn't accomplished, what was discussed and maybe didn't pass. So I'm just going to kind of run through a list of bills, and obviously if questions or comments, please slow me down if necessary. So in terms of reinvesting in K-12 education, a couple of real broad areas. One is there were a number of bills dealing with the local composite index, none of which passed, none of which went forward. You actually had bills that would go from a Fairfax perspective in both directions, some that would improve the local composite index from our perspective, and some that would make it worse. I will give you the cautionary tale that the one that got the most discussion actually would have made it worse for Fairfax. It's a bill having to do with state policy for how land is valued in certain rural and agricultural areas. And actually the impact statement that came out on that bill would have reduced Fairfax state funding by $23 million over the biennium had it gone forward. One of those pieces of legislation didn't fail. It was actually what they call continued to 2017. During a budget year, they have a process whereby they can say, you know what, we want to have a little bit more time to discuss this. They can, instead of having the bill fail, they can actually say it's being continued. In theory, they can come back to it any time between now and the beginning of the next General Assembly session. In practice, they usually don't. It's very rare that a bill that's being continued comes back. But it is a signal that it's something that they're interested in looking at. And then also in terms of, that was a bill, it was actually House Joint Resolution 50, and that dealt with the composite index of local ability to pay and the use value of real estate in certain localities. Just so you know, by the way, I'm going to walk through a lot of bills. We're finishing up our kind of final report that's going to have comprehensive list of all the bills that passed, all the bills that failed, all the bills, and that we update that from the time of the General Assembly ending, because obviously a lot of bills haven't been finalized, and then we come back and we revisit it after the reconvene session and kind of give a final list of bills. So all that information we'll make available to you. In terms of broad reinvestment in K-12 education, there was a joint study commission that was set up that actually is going to look at the standards of quality. It's not the JLARC, the Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission study that everybody's been asking for. It's a legislative study, so it's going to be staffed. The members are going to be members of the House and the Senate. But at least it is a further discussion of the standards of quality and their adequacy and whether or not they need to be revisited or amended. Just as a side note, at the same time, the State Board of Education is also looking at the standards of quality. Standards of quality, I apologize if I'm using jargon, a lot of the standards of quality deal with things like staffing ratios, and a lot of our funding is driven by the ratios that you can find in the standards of quality in the Code of Virginia. So that study is going forward, and I think it's a 2-year joint committee. So that discussion will be ongoing. Now, in terms of the specifics you have on your reinvestment, the first couple, proportionate state sales tax and shifting positions set from under the support position cap, there was no real discussion of those. The next one is the cost of competing adjustment for support positions, and this, I have to say, is probably the most significant accomplishment of the Fairfax delegation and of the Northern Virginia delegation in general, is to actually restore this funding. This is funding that had been removed from the budget in previous years, and typically once funding falls out of a budget, it doesn't come back. And the fact that they were able to not only bring it back, but also bring it back in both years of the biennium is fairly significant. And it generated a significant amount of revenue for Fairfax, both in fiscal year 17 and in fiscal year 18. There were proposals to provide additional state funding for ESL teachers. There were actually 2 bills and 2 budget amendments, none of which went forward, but there were attempts to increase that funding. On VRS, they did retain the policy that was proposed in the governor's introduced budget of accelerating the VRS rate in fiscal year 18, which will have a significant impact on us. Something they did on the state side, so for the state pension pool, is they completely paid down the unfunded or the deferred liabilities that they had accumulated over the last number of years. That had a really significant impact on the state VRS rate, and I think there may be some interest, especially if going forward there's additional revenue, of doing something similar on the teacher pool side. The teacher pool is actually larger than the state pool, plus the 4 smaller pools for constitutional officers and sheriffs. So I think that there may be some interest in doing that, but they weren't able to do it, obviously, in this year. I think it was $188 million to pay down the state side on the VRS.
I'm sorry, this is all a narrative, but are there any notes that go with this, or?
As of right now, no. There will be. I have notes that I can provide to you after we're finished here, but I don't have anything that I can just kind of hand to you.
So we're not following through anything I mean, this is just completely anecdotal right now.
It's not anecdotal. It's legislation.
But you're just doing a narrative. There's nothing that we're following right now, because I don't see anything in the agenda.
Correct. What I'm doing is I'm using this as kind of the framework to talk about various legislation that was discussed during the session.
If I understand, Michael, what you're trying to say is the session just ended, so you're going ahead and giving us an update, and then once you have time to actually put all of this information into a report, we'll get it.
Correct.
Right. So let's let him finish. He has about 10 minutes left to get through this. Then we're going to do questions. So.
All right. Let me prioritize then in terms of what we have here. Reversing
in terms of accomplishments, probably.
Right. Yeah. Reversing the shift of standards of quality program that are under the lottery. There actually was some fairly significant progress made on this. The House in particular, but then also the final conference budget did shift some of the programmatic items that have been shifted over the years into the lottery fund, back out of the lottery fund, into general funds, which frees up lottery funds, and that's going to come back to you. It still is somewhat encumbered, but much less so than if it came back for specific programs. The requirement is that no more than 50% of it can be used for operating. 50% or more needs to be used for non-recurring costs from the lottery funds that we're going to get back. Okay, there were a number of attempts to do things like expand taxing authority for counties and such, and none of those went anywhere. One small piece, but it's important because Thomas Jefferson, the governor's school, is really the only recipient of this change, is they did increase the cap. The state has a funding cap on the number of students that they'll fund at governor's schools. Thomas Jefferson is the only one that's even remotely close to the cap, and it's actually over it. They did increase the cap, so that drives a little bit more money, a little bit more state money back to Thomas Jefferson. Investing in early childhood education, they did very slightly re-benchmark their VPI funding. So they went from $6,000 per pupil to $61.25 per pupil. It's not a lot of money, but it's actually a lot of progress because that number has stayed at 6,000 for a number of years and usually does not get updated. And then there was budget language that would allow for up to 15% of VPI slots to be filled based on local criteria as opposed to the state criteria. So if you, for example, in Fairfax, because we're a high-cost jurisdiction, if we wanted to have some rules about VPI eligibility that, adjusted the rates of poverty to account for cost of living, that would be something we would be able to do under budget language. And then also, just to continue the study theme, there was and this will be a JLARC study of early childhood programs. And the results of that are due prior to the 2018 session of the General Assembly, so another 2-year study. But this is done by the analytical wing of the General Assembly, so that's going to be more of a research-based. Continued reform to standards of learning assessments. You did have a few pieces. They're going to continue to roll out computer adaptive testing with the intent of shortening the duration of the test for students and focusing more on kind of the computer side. There was a specific request that was made of the SOL Innovation Committee to look at high school, the high school side of things in terms of the number of tests that are taken at the high school level. That's going to be due to the General Assembly by November 1st of 2016, so it's a specific requirement or specific request to them. There was also some changes dealing with alternative assessments for English language learners and also possibility of additional alternative assessments for both English language learners and also for students with disabilities. Again, keeping to the same standards, but changing the modes of the test to maybe help students be able to better demonstrate their ability to deal with content level information. There were a few bills that tried to roll back the number of SOL tests even further. In fact, there were 5 that tried to roll it back all the way to federal minimums, but none of those went anywhere. On the pathways to graduation, couple of pieces in terms of you've got the request to increase the number of courses that satisfy a high school graduation requirement. One thing that came up this year was substituting coding for foreign language. There were actually 4 bills that would have done that, none of which went forward. And I can get into the various reasons, or the various reasons that we've heard why they didn't go forward. But those were proposed and discussed this year. Biggest thing in this area is what they're calling a high school redesign. The General Assembly did adopt legislation which they talked a lot about redesigning how high school is structured. This is where you're finding the language that really kind of came out of Fairfax in terms of portrait of a graduate. Now, having said that, the legislation itself is really pretty non-specific. In fact, a lot of what the legislation does is strips out references in code to things like an advanced diploma and a standard diploma. It strips out references to verified units of credit, which are the credits that students can only earn by having taken an SOL test or an approved substitute. The reason that they stripped out that language from code is that, for the most part, graduation requirements are governed by the State Board of Education under the standard of accreditation. I think what they were trying to do was to clear some of that out of the way so that there weren't, as the State Board continues its work on the standards of accreditation and talking about Portrait of a Graduate and talking about redesigning high school and how high school is structured, I think they wanted to get some of the possible impediments in the code out of the way. It doesn't mean that advanced and standard diplomas are going away, because those are still in the standards of accreditation. It doesn't mean the verified units of credits are going away, but it frees up some space for them to have broader discussions about those pieces. And you're going to have kind of a triumvirate. You're going to have the General Assembly weighing in, you're going to have the Standards of Learning Innovation Committee weighing in, and then at the end of the day, really the broadest authority is the State Board of Education under the Standards of Accreditation. And that's where you're going to see most of the work there. I understand that you were supposed to have had a work session on high school redesign, but postponed it. A lot of the information about this particular high school redesign and also the standards of accreditation, I had worked with them on, so they have the most up-to-date information about, kind of where the state is and where the process is. One thing that they built into the high school redesign bill, and I have to tell you, I don't think I've ever seen a bill that had as many what are called enactment clauses. So at the end of a bill, there are clauses about how a bill is actually supposed to be enacted. This bill had 6, and they were all about things like there needs to be a 12-month public comment period. There needs to be hearings on this in each one of the 8 superintendents' regions at 2 different junctures. There has to be a look back for anything the State Board does to go back to the General Assembly for their consideration, so that all kinds of opportunities for input into the process that were built in on that legislation.
3-minute warning.
Okay. Attracting and retaining high-quality personnel. You've seen the headlines, obviously, about the state share of the 2% salary increase. That's fairly significant. There was a good deal of movement on flexibility for licensure, particularly in CTE. A couple of bills went through that would allow for some kind of different types of licenses, a 3-year license for people who are qualified to teach specific subject areas, and also some waiver possibilities for teachers who had obviously industry experience, but not necessarily teaching credentials. So there were some bills that dealt with that. And then let's see, one other I know that you will be interested in is the legislation dealing with passing stop school buses and the stop arm cameras, and that legislation actually did pass both the House and the Senate, and obviously awaiting the governor's opinion on that. But that would allow the RFP that I think that we had in Fairfax to employ those types of cameras on buses. It would allow that to go forward, and it would allow for the mailing of the summons as opposed to having to do it in person, which was the real big impediment. Obviously, you've seen the headlines, so you see that there was way more discussed during the General Assembly session than just that very quick overview, and you'll get a lot more information from us on the specifics of bills that didn't pass. But with the time we had, I just wanted to give you that really quick overview.
Start with Evan Strauss-Hines.
Oh, thank you very much, Michael. As you know, I was also interested in learning more about the proffer bill that passed. I've been given differing views of what the impact of that is. I've been hearing that it's going to really reduce the amount of money that we're going to get from proffers, and then Senator Zaslow said it won't have any impact on us. So do we have a sense of what the actual impact is going to be?
Honestly, I can't tell you, and because I've heard exactly the same things, and I've even heard to the point where I believe the county has said that they need to go back and look to see. I mean, even they don't have a handle necessarily on all of the impacts. One thing that's a little different for the school side of proffers as opposed to the proffer bill in general is there were a number of things in the proffer bill, things like libraries and some specific items that were stripped out. That were, you could not have proffers dealing with some of those particular governmental functions, schools stayed in. Schools were never stripped out of that. But I think at the end of the day, when you look at it and you listen to the discussions, anything that constrains the ability to secure proffers, whether it's specifically for schools or in general, is going to, will necessarily have an impact. The debate is how big an impact. It's as I said, the people who I would think would be the strongest experts in it, they can't even agree with each other in terms of where that legislation has landed.
Well, that's interesting because certainly the legislators I've talked to have had very different views of what the impact would be. So hopefully we can find somebody to nail that down for us. Two other questions. One is the VRS. It sounds like there may be good news, but I want to be sure I understand what you're saying might be coming down the pike for teachers. You're thinking next year they might be paying
As
more
of today,
in?
no, there is not good news.
Okay.
However, because last year, in the previous year, they did buy down some of the teacher, the unfunded liability. Because they did the same thing this time, but they actually completely took the state side unfunded liability out of the picture because it's
Okay.
now completely paid off.
Okay.
If there is surplus money and they do decide to do the same thing next time, the teacher pool would be where they would put it.
Okay.
So that would be, across the board, local government, school divisions, and even the state, I think, has an interest in doing that because it
Okay.
lowers everybody's costs.
Right.
It's just a matter of if the revenues end up being available, and that
Okay.
we won't know until we see revenue forecasts going forward.
And I guess that would be an area that we would want to advocate for strongly next year.
Yes, and actually the groundwork's already been laid.
Okay. And then just one final simple question. The cap on TJ was raised to what?
I think 1,800. I think it went
great,
from
'cause that's where we
1,725
are.
to 1,800. Yeah, I think.
Excellent.
I think we're right near the top. There was one other thing that happened with governor's school funding. The governor's introduced budget had a kind of a tweaked formula for how to send money back for governor's schools. That formula would have benefited TJ, but it was very heavily skewed towards the part day programs. So they actually kind of went back to the drawing board, said, okay, we need to relook at this formula and make some sense of it, that we make sure that the full day programs are actually getting the bulk of the funding. So I think they're going to revisit it over the interim and then come back next year with a tweaked formula, and that may drive even additional money to TJ above and beyond the change in the cap. It really was the change in the cap that changed our funding this time around.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Evans. Ms. Strauss, then Ms. Hines.
Okay, going back to the governor's school and TJ with the additional raising the cap to 1,800, can we use this money then, local money that is perhaps no longer needed at TJ, or is this a non-supplant? Because they did, the last time it was a non-supplant.
That's actually an excellent question, and I don't know.
Because that will be important, and it'll be important now.
I don't know if the specifics of the budget language said that, or if it was simply a change in the number itself.
Right.
And I don't recall what.
Because if it's a
which one it was.
non-supplant, then it's great. The school, that school will have more money to spend, but it doesn't help our overall budget. With regard to the VRS, because again, those are big numbers, and basically what we understand now is that the 16.8 million in additional revenue that we are getting from the state from all sources, we are told that if the VRS, if the state's not able to contribute directly to the deficit for that the 2018 year additional state money would be taken up completely with our obligation back to VRS.
I think I'm gonna look
Is
back
that
over my right shoulder, but I think that's true. I think that
That's what we're being told.
In fiscal year 18, any additional money that we got from the state would be completely eaten up by the local cost of implementing the new VRS rates.
Right, because as we obviously work with our local funders, that part of the conversation continues to be very important to all of us, because those are big dollars, and to know how that's going to apply. What would be the timetable in terms of whether or not we would know whether or not the state intends to do something else with VRS? how late in the game?
Well, I would say it would be part of the next budget cycle for the state. So it would really be a discussion for the governor's introduced budget, because he'll come.
So not until
he'll-
next December, January?
Not until next, those discussions will be happening over the summer and over the fall. But yeah, you would not see a specific proposal until the governor introduced his budget, which is mid-December.
So there isn't any chance of declared increase in sales tax or something that would happen ahead of time that would change the state contribution?
Typically not. There are some pretty specific rules for if there's a surplus. If the state has a surplus, that money pretty much is entirely spoken for in the current fiscal year. But what it does is it frees up money that the governor would be able to allocate in the next fiscal year. But again, that wouldn't be allocated until he made his specific budget amendment request, and that wouldn't come until December. So we could get some signals if we got good revenue numbers and it looked like their revenue projections were going to be well above what they budgeted based on, and there was additional funding, that would then just increase the discussion about how to use that funding, and this I think would be one of the priority areas to ask to have it sent to.
But what you're saying is the reality is that we will end up beginning to build the 2018 budget based on the expectation that $16.8 million would be, we would have to give it back to the VRS.
Yeah, no, you definitely would have to build the budget based on that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Strauss, Ms. Hines, then Ms. Schultz.
Thank you. Good to get caught up. So a question, follow-up on the VRS acceleration. I'm assuming that hurts pretty much every school district, every division in the
Yes.
state? Okay,
Yeah.
nobody benefits. I mean, I suppose, because I have heard that VEA may support it because they see it as funding their pensions, but.
VEA's position for years and years, obviously, is they're focused on the solvency of the system, and this is just a way to ensure the solvency, and it ensures that it puts additional funding into it a year even earlier than they had planned. If you remember, probably 5 or 6 years back, the General Assembly made the decision that they were going to get themselves to 100% of the actuary rate, but they were going to do it in stair steps. So every 2 years, they were going to by 10% increments go up, up, up. This was supposed to be the year where it was 90% of actuary both years. They decided to accelerate it even further and go 90% in the first year of the biennium, and then jump it all the way to the 100% in the second year of the biennium.
Okay, but so fixing that all the districts and localities around the state will be unified in trying to push that off.
Equally.
Okay.
It hits high LCI jurisdictions, low LCI jurisdictions. It hits local governments. It hits everybody equally.
Okay, great. So just one more question. Looking at the studies of SOQs, you said there are 2 coming up, and one is the Joint Study Committee, not JLARC, right? But
Correct.
just legislative. And then the other is the State Board of Ed, also
Correct.
looking at it. So I was just wondering, how is there a way that our board can weigh in or participate in those studies? Is that-
Absolutely.
Okay.
More so probably on the Board of Ed side, because and we don't know the specific structure of the General Assembly study, but it is going to be entirely populated by General Assembly members. They will bring in people to talk about various issues. They will rely on staff. They will rely on input, and I'm sure that they will solicit input. I think you have a more direct path with the state board, because the state board, at the same time as they're looking at the standards of accreditation and doing their comprehensive review there and asking for opinions about changes, they're doing the same thing with the standards of quality. It's a little quieter because the standards of accreditation is obviously a bigger, more of a focus with graduation requirements and such. But the SOQ review is going forward. And I was actually just in Richmond today, and they discussed 2 of the standards of quality. They simply just had a presentation on what was in each of them. They weren't the big important ones. The big important one really is standard 2. That's where most of the staffing standards are. But there were some discussion of some of the other standards, and that's going to be ongoing, and we can provide input to the state board at any time on that.
Okay, so I guess then I would ask sort of how we go forward and do that, because I think it's in our legislative packet that we would like the reform of the SOQs, and that's the kind of thing they're working on. So I don't know that we need to reconsider whether we're in favor of SOQ reform. We are, So given that, how would our state legislative,
I think there were components that are already in your program, but I can also work with the budget office to identify kind of particular bang for the buck areas. An example would be the ESL. The ESL staffing standards. The bills that were put in this year would have increased the staffing from 17 per thousand to 22 per thousand. We staff right about 22, 23, 24 here in Fairfax, so that would have essentially been, I don't want to say free state money, because that's not quite the right term, but it's state money that would help to cover the cost of something we're already paying for 100% entirely locally. So if we can identify areas like that where we would get the greatest bang for the buck, those are where, I think those where you'd want to put your emphasis.
okay, so just to wrap it up then, practically speaking, I think maybe our state legislative liaison could work on making sure that the board has these opportunities to weigh in. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Sounds good. Okay, thanks. Ms. Schultz, then Ms. Corbett Sanders.
Just quickly, on the LCI bill that you referenced,
The land use one?
the
or-
land use, the land use one.
Yeah.
I would be interested, and I think it would be a good idea for the rest of us to actually get the background on that and who voted for it, so
Absolutely.
we can see, so the more detail about that one, because that potentially, I'm having early warning detection systems about that one, that could have massive implications, and I think we've got to understand the downstream effect that should that come back up and come to pass next year, what the implications of that would be. So the background on it, what the financial implications are, who voted for it, and and basically almost a strategy around starting a strategy now around making sure that does not move forward in the next general session.
We actually have, as part of the discussion, the Virginia Department of Education generated a spreadsheet that showed everybody whose funding would go up, everybody whose funding would go down, and it because it deals really with rural and agricultural land use. You can guess that the Fairfaxes, the Henricos, the Virginia Beaches, the Richmond cities of the world did poorly, and it really was both rural, but it was really more of kind of the edge communities, the Fakirs and the Albemarles that did particularly well.
The reason why this is very important is if you think about Chris's J. Lark study, Chris Brownlick's J. Lark study op-ed that he basically wrote, which talked about the egress from the from Commonwealth jurisdictions to Northern Virginia. What they're looking for effectively is a model that continues to bring in more money for fewer students. And so it's the proportionality of where the students are that I have a question about. The other question is related to we got off on a sidetrack and I forgot what the second one was.
We'll come back. Corbett Sanders, followed by McLaughlin.
I'll make this quick. There were two additional bills that I understand. One got passed and one I think is a continuance. The bill regarding cell towers and needing to get agreement by surrounding communities.
Actually, that's one that we had not followed. So I'm just recently hearing about that discussion. That was more of a local government. I mean, that went through the local government side of the world. So we didn't. That wasn't something that we had been involved with.
Okay. The only reason I mention it is because oftentimes if you put a cell tower in a location, they will actually give a subsidy or a portion of the revenues back to a location, in particular schools. And so this might be an opportunity for us. And so I just wanted to raise that. And then the second one, the state health plan and the concept of possibly moving all of the teachers in the state of Virginia into a single health plan.
Actually, the legislation that passed would allow localities to opt in. It would not be kind of a blanket, everybody had to participate, but this would give obviously smaller jurisdictions the ability to opt into the state plan, which may help to decrease their costs. Now, for us, it may not be the way to go, but it was optional. It was not a requirement that you participate.
VEA actually came out with an ad on it. That's why I was wondering, saying that they actually endorsed it. So I was wondering.
And actually, that's something they've been working on for probably a decade or more, is trying to get access for especially for school systems and also for some smaller local governments to be able to pool together in that bigger pool. So yeah, I'm sure they're trumpeting a hard-fought success.
Okay, Ms. McLaughlin, followed by Ms. Paltrick.
So thank you, Michael. I really appreciate this, and I look forward to when you have a chance to really capture it all. I think it was certainly a very active session, it seemed like.
Absolutely.
And I appreciate your hard work down there. One of the things that I've been wrestling with, and I think I'm most disappointed, is the governor, who I know has always been a supporter of public schools. Why was he proposing that the VRS be, accelerated, and, the contributions really hit us hard for FY18 versus extending it to 19? I mean, to me, it's counterintuitive to what our belief was the governor's support. So am I missing something here? And can you provide some clarity? Because I think this is some of the most disappointing news that we got.
I think when you look at the issue, you can actually argue it from both sides for education, because you can argue it from the teacher / recipient of pension side of the ledger, which is, their interest is in making sure that the system is as solvent as possible. And over the last number of decades, the state, one of the very first places they went when they had an economic downturn was to go into the retirement pool and to siphon money off from that. So I think that this was in their interest to try and protect the pension system as it exists, and to protect existing pensioners, and obviously ones that are coming in as well. So you can, and I think that was the balancing act that they were trying to wrestle with in the General Assembly, is there were some benefits to taking this off of the ledgers. When they did the state side going up to 100%, but when they paid off that unfunded liability, the state rate went down by a point and a half. So there's the possibility that we're going to see kind of the same thing. It just may be delayed. We're hopeful that we're going to see something similar. But as I said, it was really kind of a balance for them as to which side, and you could argue it from either direction.
I understand what you're saying, but if, it's not as if we extended it and made it less painful to pay it out by the FY19 versus FY18, that the VRS would be in jeopardy. So,
those arguments were made. I mean,
So, right.
people brought those arguments up, and they didn't win the day. That was kind of the end result.
But I get we can't control sometimes what the General Assembly decides to do, but I guess what I have not heard yet is where the calculations done by the governor and saying if one of the wealthiest school divisions in the entire Commonwealth is going to find that this FY18 demand is going to be difficult on our budgets, what's it like for the ones who have even more challenging fiscal? It does not seem supportive of public schools to accelerate this and make it done by 18, because I haven't heard from you, and I haven't heard from anyone that extending it to 19 puts the VRS in jeopardy. But it would seem to me that it puts less harm into the fact that something's going to have to be cut in terms of meaningful programs and services in our public schools in order to pay the VRS in 18. Correct?
As I said, every single one of those arguments was made, and as I said before, this does affect every single jurisdiction, and every single jurisdiction has exactly the same issue with it that we did. It was true on the local government side. It's true on the school side. That argument didn't end up winning the day. So,
Okay, Ms.
If I
Powell?
could add one thing, districts that have a much lower LCI and receive a greater proportion of their funding from the state, the impact of the VRS rate will be less on them because they will get a greater amount of state funding. So that might have kind of blunted some of their concern about that. And they may also be thinking we have to pay eventually, but that additional state funding might have kind of helped lessen the egregiousness of the rate acceleration.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Palchik, followed by Schultz.
Thanks, Michael. A couple quick questions. I thought I read somewhere, I may have been wrong, was coding added as a science credit?
Coding, actually last year, there was a bill that allowed computer science to count towards science credits, or science or math credits, and the state board did come up with some guidelines for how those substitutions were done, but that was done in the last session. This session, they were discussing the specific substitution of coding for a foreign language, and that didn't go forward.
Thank you. I have another question. The mixed information I received around the proffer bill is actually when we became aware of that. I think I had from legislators and from members from supervisors different ideas of when they knew about this bill. So I'm just wondering right now, luckily it seems like it may not have touched schools as much as it could have, but just moving into the future, is there anything, we in our delegation or, could do in the future just to have a little bit more leeway to know if bills like this are coming through the assembly?
Part of the challenge of what we face, and we meaning education in general, is that a bill like that went through the local government committee. It didn't go through the education committee. So the committees that we're focused on, that didn't come through. Now, I did hear about the bill from the county, and I heard it from other local government advocates, but I didn't hear about it. Obviously, I didn't hear about it from the very first day it was being discussed. But I think one thing that would help, better communication, between school boards, local governments, to talk about those kinds of issues that have that mutual potential impact. Definitely, and I'm co-located with the county staff in Richmond,
that
so
was
I
new
do.
this year, right?
Yeah. So I see them on a regular basis, and I think that just alone is going to help foster communication and help to identify bills like that.
I'm just concerned because I heard that from some of our legislators felt that they knew about it, before the supervisors may have known about it or started to talk about it, and I just want to make sure if there's anything we can do to help keep that from happening in the future,
I think it's something we'll look at our processes for how we kind of identify bills that have an impact, and the bill that Ms. Corbett-Sanders brought up about the cell towers is another one that we'll kind of look at the spread of what we cover and what we pay attention to. We may not do anything about it, but they may be things that we want to keep on our radar a little bit earlier.
Okay, Elizabeth, last word.
The other thing I wanted to ask is, can you just give us just a little flavor of how the taxing authority bills went, other than down in flames? But if you could just...
Extraordinarily perfunctory. There wasn't much discussion of them at all.
There was no discussion even.
Very little.
And where did those bills originate?
Let's see. They went through, on the Senate side, they went through the Senate Finance Committee, and on the House side.
No. I mean, who
put them in? Actually, they were mostly from our legislators.
So they did originate from up here.
Yes. Let me see. Kathleen Murphy was one. Kay Corey was one. Barbara Favola was one. Vivian Watts was one. And in fact, those are the four that I have here on my list. They're all from Northern Virginia.
And was there any attempt to coordinate that with, were those just sacrifice flies or?
Well, the legislation that Delegate Corey and Senator Favola put in would have actually only applied to the cigarette tax, and it would have only applied to the local cigarette tax, which is only available in Fairfax and Arlington. So automatically you're starting at a bit of a disadvantage when you're looking at a piece of legislation that only benefits 2 jurisdictions out of 132. So they were focused in just on that specific authority that
Well,
are
why,
2.
then I would think if the legislators up here wanted it and it affects those of us up here, why would anybody else care?
That's a question you'll have to ask General Assembly members.
Okay.
Because, because they, as I said, the discussions of those tend to be very perfunctory. They go through the Senate Finance Committee on the Senate side, and then the House Finance Committee on the House side, and usually don't get much in the way
So
of discussion.
I'm gonna do, my semi-regular perennial commercial. If this board wants to decide in the next legislative package to do this in earnest, then that kind of flack approach by just some legislators doing some things and not necessarily a coordinated, marketed effort behind why, then I think we ought to seriously consider it. So this is for the filing cabinet or the parking lot or wherever we put these, but I'd like to make that, I'm planting the flag now that if we're going to talk about this in earnest, we need to plan in advance and have a discussion about taxing authority, because I, for one, have come a long way on this one, and I am willing to at least have the conversation with my colleagues on the board, and we're at the beginning of a 4-year, endeavor together, and so if we want to do this as part of one of our missions, then we need to start talking about it.
Okay, that has been filed. Thank you, Mr. Malloy. Best of luck. Let us know how the governor votes on or vetoes or does not veto some of the passages.
Yeah, as I said, his next kind of due date isn't until April 10th, so we probably won't hear much about legislation until then. But we'll keep you up to date as it goes forward.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, 2 minutes, then we are starting on the third one.
Right, audit. And Ms. Trump, if you would like to come and sit up here so you are ready to answer questions. And we will wait for the technology to catch up.